Can you imagine being declared dead by your own parents because of a mistake at 16? A cold, rainy night, one small suitcase, and a door slammed shut. That was the moment Grace Myers' life changed forever. My name is Grace Myers. I'm 36 years old now, but there is a memory that has followed me for 20 years, one I have never been able to forget. It's not a happy memory of youth, nor a warm family story like people often share. It's the moment my own parents erased me from their lives simply because I got pregnant in the 10th grade. I was only 16 years old at the time, the age when I should have been worrying about school tests, friends, and dreams that were just beginning to take shape. Instead, I was forced to face a harsh reality. I no longer had a family. I still remember that night vividly. It was November, cold and rainy, and the drops didn't just soak my clothes. They seemed to seep into my bones. I stood outside the front door with a small suitcase, everything I was allowed to take, while my mother stood inside, pointing toward the street, and telling me I was no longer her daughter. There were no tears, no hesitation, just a cold decision delivered, as if I had never existed. My father didn't even look at me one last time. He stood behind her, silent but firm, as if my existence had become a stain that needed to be erased to protect the family's reputation. What hurt me the most wasn't being thrown out. It was how easily and decisively they did it, as if they had already prepared for this moment, as if I was nothing more than a mistake that needed correction. That very same night, they went even further by drafting legal papers to completely cut ties with me, not only with me, but also with the child I was carrying. A life that hadn't even been born yet was already denied existence. They didn't just abandon me emotionally, they erased me legally, as if that would help preserve the perfect image they had spent years building. For the next 20 years, they told everyone I had moved abroad, that I had chosen a different life, and they continued living as if they never had a daughter named Grace. As for me, from that moment standing in the rain, I understood that my life would never be the same again. I was no longer a little girl in a perfect family. I became someone who had to survive on her own, fight on her own, and define her own worth. And the irony is that moment of being cast out became the starting point of everything I would later achieve. But at that time, I was just a 16-year-old girl, trembling in the rain, with a broken heart, and a future that felt completely uncertain. If you had looked at my family from the outside back then, you would have thought we were the ideal family everyone wished for. My father was a successful real estate attorney with his own firm downtown, a name spoken with respect in both business circles and the local community. My mother was the perfect woman by societal standards, always well-dressed, smiling at the right moments, and serving as president of the Parent-Teacher Association for several consecutive years. Every Sunday, we sat in the front pew at church, wearing coordinated outfits chosen the night before, as if we were a carefully staged portrait for others to admire. But no one saw what happened behind that polished image, because that perfection was only a surface. Beneath it was an invisible but very real hierarchy, where each child had a defined place, and that place determined their value within the family. My older brother Nathan was the pride of the family, studying dentistry and expected to carry on the family legacy. Dinner conversations revolved around his achievements, his clinical rotations, and his promising future. My sister Carolyn was beautiful, obedient, and never questioned anything, the perfect daughter my mother proudly presented to others. And then there was me, the one my mother once called a surprise, the child born, when she thought her life was already settled, an unplanned detail she never truly accepted. I was never openly mistreated. There were no physical punishments or harsh insults. But the quiet neglect that stretched over the years was far more damaging. In the living room, family photos were displayed proudly, yet mine were often missing, as if my presence wasn't significant enough to be remembered. At dinner, when I tried to share my academic achievements, my father would nod briefly before shifting the focus back to Nathan, as if my success was expected and unremarkable. I learned to stay quiet, to expect less, to make myself small, so I wouldn't disrupt the fragile balance of the household. Over time, I realized that love in my family wasn't unconditional. It was something you had to earn by meeting expectations, and I always seemed to fall short. My father often repeated a phrase at family gatherings. Reputation takes 20 years to build and 5 minutes to destroy. As a child, I didn't fully understand it. I thought it was just general life advice. But as I grew older, I realized that to him, reputation wasn't just important. It was more important than his own children. And within that system of values, I wasn't someone to protect, but a potential risk, a factor that could destroy everything he had built. The saddest part is that I accepted that role for a long time. I believed I was somehow less than my siblings, that I needed to try harder to be loved, without realizing that love in my family had never been distributed fairly to begin with. That environment shaped who I was long before everything fell apart, making me grateful for even the smallest kindness from others, and making the eventual rejection far more devastating. Because deep down, I always hoped that one day I would be seen as a true part of the family, a hope that was ultimately and completely destroyed. I don't remember the exact moment when I started to change, but I know the feeling built up little by little over the years, like drops of water, falling steadily until the glass finally overflows. It wasn't one big event, or a single harsh word, that broke me instantly, but hundreds, even thousands, of small moments, where I realized I didn't truly belong in the place called family. I began to notice the way my parents looked at me, not with pride or expectation, but with a kind of distant acknowledgement, as if I were just part of the background in the story of their lives. As a child, I still tried to get their attention. I brought home good grades certificates and positive feedback from teachers, hoping that this time they would look at me a little longer, smile at me a little more genuinely. But their reactions were always the same. A brief nod, a short, "That's nice," before turning back to something more important, something that never included me. Over time, I realized the problem wasn't that I wasn't trying hard enough, but that I was never a priority to begin with. That realization was painful, but what truly changed me was how I adapted to it. I learned to stay quiet, to speak less, and most importantly, to stop expecting. I sat at family dinners, like an invisible audience member, listening to conversations, centered around my siblings, nodding when necessary, smiling when acknowledged, and disappearing as soon as I could. I realized that the less attention I drew, the less disappointment I felt. It became a survival strategy, a way to protect myself from being constantly hurt by indifference. But the cost was that I began to shrink myself not only at home, but also at school and in other relationships. I stopped raising my hand in class even when I knew the answer. I stopped speaking up when I had a different opinion, because part of me believed my voice didn't matter. When you grow up in an environment where your presence is constantly overlooked, you begin to believe that your existence itself is insignificant. The dangerous part is that this feeling doesn't stay within the family. It follows you into the outside world, shaping how you see yourself and how you allow others to treat you. I became someone who was easily satisfied with very little, easily moved by simple kindness, because I wasn't used to being treated as someone of value. And that is exactly why meeting Marcus later affected me so deeply, because he was the first person who truly saw me, truly listened to me, and treated me as if I mattered. But before that, I had spent years living in a state of half existing, half disappearing, like a shadow in my own home. I don't blame that younger version of myself for choosing to shrink, because it was the only way she knew how to survive. In an environment where love was conditional and recognition had to be earned by standards she could never meet. But looking back, I realized those years shaped me profoundly, turning me into someone who was afraid to be a burden, hesitant to ask for more, and constantly questioning whether I deserved care or attention. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is not that I was abandoned later, but that I had been prepared for that abandonment long before it actually happened. I met Marcus on an afternoon that should have been completely ordinary, but looking back, it became one of the most important moments of my life. We didn't meet at a party or at school. We met at the public library downtown, the only place where I felt like I could breathe. I used to go there 3 times a week pretending to study, but really just escaping from a home where I always felt like I didn't belong. In that quiet space, surrounded by tall shelves and the smell of old books, I wasn't the imperfect child. I wasn't the one at the bottom of a family hierarchy. I was just a girl reading, and that alone made me feel more at ease than anywhere else. That day, I was sitting in the biography section, trying to read, but really holding back tears after my mother forgot to pick me up for the third time that month. I wasn't crying loudly, just silently tears falling onto the pages, and I assumed no one noticed like always. But then a voice spoke from across the table. "Are you okay?" I looked up and saw Marcus for the first time. He wasn't dressed in anything special, just a simple jacket, slightly messy hair, but his eyes stood out warm, genuine, and most importantly, truly concerned. Not the kind of question people ask out of politeness, but one where the person actually wants to hear the answer. That surprised me more than anything. I wasn't used to being asked that. Or if I was, no one ever waited for a real response. I didn't answer right away, just wiped my tears and tried to say I was fine, but Marcus didn't leave. He sat across from me, giving me enough space so I wouldn't feel pressured, and simply said, "If you're not okay, that's okay too." That sentence, as small as it sounded, was exactly what I needed to hear. We started talking at first about simple things like school and books, but for me it was the first time I truly felt heard. Marcus went to a public school. My family would have looked down on it. He worked part-time at his uncle's auto shop, and his life wasn't glamorous at all. But the way he saw the world made everything feel more real. There was no pressure to be perfect, no impossible standards, just honesty and presence. We began seeing each other more often at first, by chance at the library, then through longer walks and conversations that stretched beyond time. I kept the relationship a secret from my family. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they would never accept it. But the more time I spent with Marcus, the more I realized that being valued, being cared for, being asked, "Are you okay?" wasn't a luxury. It was something everyone deserved. Marcus didn't try to change me or force me into someone else's expectations. He was simply there, patient and kind, and that was enough to make me feel like I mattered. Maybe to others, it was just a simple teenage relationship. But to me, it was the first time I knew what it meant to be seen. And because I had lived so long, feeling invisible, having someone truly see me was powerful enough to change everything. I started smiling more, speaking more, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to shrink myself to exist. I didn't know then that this relationship would change my life in ways no one could predict, but I knew one thing: Marcus was the first person who made me believe that I wasn't a mistake. There are moments in life where a single second can change everything. And for me, it was the day I stood in the bathroom of a gas station, a few miles from school, my hands trembling as I held a pregnancy test, and saw 2 pink lines appear clearly before my eyes. I had known it was possible, but knowing and facing the reality are 2 completely different things. In that moment, all the sounds around me seemed to disappear, leaving only the pounding of my heart and a hollow feeling spreading through my body. I was only 16 years old, not even finished with high school, with no plans for a future beyond exams and summer breaks. And yet I stood there knowing I was going to become a mother. The first thing I thought about wasn't myself. It was my parents, how they would react, how they would look at me, and most importantly, how this would destroy the perfect image they had always tried to maintain. I knew them well enough to understand that their first question wouldn't be, "Are you okay?" but "What will people think?" That thought chilled me more than the cold air outside. I called Marcus right after, my hands still shaking, my voice breaking, as I tried to explain what had just happened. I had prepared myself for him to panic, to go silent, or worse, to leave me immediately, because that's what I thought anyone our age would do. But Marcus didn't do that. He listened without interrupting, and when I finally fell silent, he said something simple that was enough to keep me standing. "We'll figure this out together. You're not alone." Those words didn't make things easier, but they kept me from completely falling apart. I wanted to believe him, I really did. I wanted to believe that we could get through this, that love and determination could make up for everything we lacked: experience, money, and preparation. But deep down, I was still afraid, not just of the future, but because I knew the real storm hadn't arrived yet. The days that followed felt unreal. I went to school, did my homework, talked to friends, like nothing had changed. But in my mind, there was always a voice, reminding me that everything had already shifted. Every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't just see a 16-year-old girl anymore. I saw someone carrying a secret that could destroy her entire life. Marcus and I met more often, talking about different possibilities, keeping the baby, finding a way to manage, even leaving if necessary. But all of our plans were vague, incomplete, lacking any real foundation. Eventually, I knew I couldn't hide it forever. My body would change, time wouldn't stop, and the truth would come out, whether I wanted it to or not. I decided to tell my parents at a Sunday dinner, the one time when the whole family would be together. I thought about it endlessly, rehearsed what I would say, imagined every possible reaction, even naively hoped that they might be shocked, but eventually accepted that they might choose me over their reputation just this once. But deep inside, I knew I was gambling on something. I had never truly had their understanding. That night, as I sat at the table looking at familiar faces that suddenly felt like strangers, I realized that no matter what happened next, my life was about to take a completely different direction. And when I finally said, "I have something to tell you," I wasn't just revealing a secret, I was opening a door to a reality I wasn't ready to face, but had no choice except to walk into. I thought the hardest moment was seeing those 2 lines on the pregnancy test, but I was wrong. Because what truly terrified me was that Sunday dinner, the moment I had to tell my family the truth. Everything happened just like any other dinner, which somehow made it even more suffocating. My mother set the table perfectly, as always. My father talked about work. My siblings added their usual conversations, and I sat there, staring at my plate, unable to swallow even a bite. I had rehearsed the words in my head dozens of times, trying to find the gentlest way to say it, the least painful way. But deep down, I knew there was no way to make this acceptable to them. When I finally said, "I have something to tell you," the entire table fell silent. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting. It was the first time in a long time that I felt truly seen, and ironically, it was the moment I wished I could disappear. I took a deep breath and said the words I had been holding in, "I'm pregnant." What happened next unfolded so quickly that I could barely process it. My mother dropped her fork onto her plate, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the silence. My father didn't yell immediately. He just sat there, his cold gaze fixed on me, as if assessing a problem to solve. His first question was exactly what I expected. "Who is the father?" There was no concern for how I felt. No question of whether I was okay, only control and calculation. When I said Marcus's name and explained that he went to a public school and worked at an auto shop, the atmosphere shifted completely. My mother went pale and my father stood up from the table as if that information had crossed a line he could not tolerate. "You will not keep this baby," he said, his voice firm like an order. My throat tightened, but for the first time in my life, I didn't stay silent. "I'm keeping it," I said, my voice trembling but clear. That answer ignited everything. My father looked at me not as a daughter anymore, but as something that needed to be removed. "If you keep that baby, you are no longer part of this family." Those words fell like a sentence. For a brief moment, I waited, hoping my mother would intervene, that she would say something, anything to protect me. But she didn't. She simply looked at me, her expression cold, then turned to my father, as if agreeing. There was no argument, no chance to explain, no space for compassion. Everything was decided in minutes, but the consequences would last a lifetime. By 9 p.m., I was standing outside the house with a suitcase beside me, rain beginning to fall heavily. My mother was the one who opened the door and pointed outside, not my father. That hurt more than anything, because I had always hoped even a little that she would be the one to stop me from leaving. I looked up at the second-floor window and saw my siblings watching, but neither of them came down. No one said a word. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for a small miracle, a call, a gesture, anything that showed they still cared. The door closed behind me, and in that moment, I understood that everything was over. Not just an argument, not a temporary decision, but the complete end of the relationship I once called family. I stepped off the porch, the rain soaking through my clothes, cold against my skin, but that cold was nothing compared to the emptiness inside me. I wasn't just thrown out. I was rejected, erased, as if my existence had never mattered. And as I walked away from that house in the rain, I wasn't just leaving a place. I was leaving behind a life I once believed was mine. After the door slammed shut behind me that night, I didn't have time to process what had just happened, because reality hit me immediately. I stood in the rain, gripping my small suitcase, my mind completely blank, not knowing where to go, what to do, or even how to begin. The cold wasn't just from the weather, it came from the overwhelming feeling of being completely abandoned, as if the world I once knew had disappeared within minutes. I remember walking aimlessly down the street, each step heavy on the familiar road that suddenly felt foreign until I stopped at a gas station a few blocks away. It was the only place still open. Its dim yellow lights, reflecting off the wet concrete, creating a scene that felt both cold and lonely. I stepped into a public phone booth, my hands shaking so badly, I almost dropped the coins as I tried to call Marcus. When he answered after just a few rings, I could barely speak, only managing to repeat through tears that I had been kicked out. I had prepared myself for many scenarios in the days before, but I never imagined things would happen so quickly and decisively. Marcus didn't ask many questions, didn't panic, didn't blame me. He simply said, "Stay there. I'm coming." 20 minutes later, an old truck pulled up to the station, and Marcus jumped out before it even fully stopped. He wrapped his jacket around me, held me tightly as I broke down crying. And in that moment, for the first time that night, I didn't feel completely alone. But even with Marcus, their reality didn't change. We were just two teenagers with a few $100s, an old truck, and no real plan for the future. We drove in silence for a while, trying to figure out where to go, until I remembered the only person who might help Mrs. Torres, a neighbor who lived a few houses down from my parents. She was the only person in the neighborhood who didn't treat my father with fear, and one of the few who had ever smiled at me as if I truly existed. When we knocked on her door around 10 p.m., I didn't know what I would say, or whether she would even let us in. But the moment she opened the door and saw me standing there, soaked and trembling with a suitcase, she seemed to understand everything without needing an explanation. "Come in," she said, her voice firm but warm. "You can stay as long as you need." That simple but powerful sentence saved me at a moment when I thought I had nowhere left to go. For the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I stayed in her small guest room, trying to piece our lives back together from nothing. But even as I began to find a small sense of stability, my parents didn't stop. Just 3 days after I was thrown out, I received a certified letter that required my signature, as if it were a business transaction. Inside were carefully drafted legal documents stating that I forfeited all inheritance rights and that the family had no obligation to me or the child I was carrying. I read every line, feeling each word cut into me all over again. They hadn't just thrown me out, they wanted to make sure I could never come back, that no connection remained, not even the smallest one. It was no longer an act of anger, it was a calculated, cold, and final decision. I kept that document not because I still had hope for my family, but because I needed proof for myself that everything that happened was real, that I hadn't imagined that level of cruelty. And in those days, as I faced the reality of being completely cut off from my past, I began to understand that my life would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, with no protection, no safety net, just myself, and the choices I would have to take full responsibility for. The first days after being thrown out weren't an inspiring story of strength, like people might imagine, but rather a blur of exhaustion, uncertainty, and constant worry about the most basic things: what to eat, where to sleep, and what tomorrow would bring. Even with Marcus by my side, and Mrs. Torres opening her door to help, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on a thin line where one small mistake could make everything collapse. The 2 weeks we spent at Mrs. Torres's house passed faster than I expected, not because time flew, but because I lived in a constant state of tension, trying to use every day to find a clearer direction for the future. Marcus worked more hours, taking extra shifts at his uncle's auto shop, while I began seriously thinking about how I could become fully independent, without relying on someone else's kindness for too long. Eventually, we found a small studio apartment in Seattle, located above a laundromat that always smelled faintly of bleach and steam. The rent wasn't cheap compared to what we had, but it was our only option, and more importantly, it was the first place I could call home after being thrown out. The room was tiny. Just a few steps could take you from one end to the other. The old bed creaked every time we moved, and the small window looked out onto a narrow alley. But to me, it meant something entirely different. It was a symbol of starting over from nothing. Life there wasn't easy. We had to count every dollar, eat the simplest meals sometimes, just instant noodles or discounted bread from a nearby shop. But what kept me going wasn't comfort. It was the feeling that I was slowly gaining control over my life, even if only in small ways. I began learning things I had never had to think about before: managing money, finding part-time work, balancing my health, my studies, and my pregnancy. Every day brought new challenges, and there were moments when I felt like I couldn't go on, especially as my body started to change. Exhaustion set in, and the future still felt uncertain. But each time, I would look at Marcus, still there, still patient, still believing we could make it through, and that gave me the strength to stand up again. The most important thing I realized during this time wasn't that life was getting easier, but that I was changing the way I saw myself. Before, I thought I was weak, dependent, not good enough. But now, with no one left to rely on, I was forced to face myself and discover a strength I never knew I had. I learned to take responsibility for every decision, to face consequences without blaming others, and most importantly, to believe that I could keep going even when things weren't perfect. My new life didn't come with protection or guarantees, but it gave me something I had never had before: the power to choose my own path. And in those difficult days, I began to understand that just because you are pushed out of one world doesn't mean you can't create another for yourself, even if it's small, imperfect, but truly yours. If you've ever had to start over from nothing with no one backing you up, drop a comment so I know how strong you've been. I thought being thrown out into the cold rain was the lowest point of my life, but I was wrong, because just a few days later, I realized that my parents didn't just want to remove me from their lives emotionally, they wanted to erase me completely, permanently, and without any possibility of a return. 3 days after I left, while Marcus and I were still trying to stabilize our temporary situation at Mrs. Torres's house, I received a certified letter that required my signature, as if it were an important document in a business transaction. The moment I saw the sender's name, my heart sank, but I still signed, for it still opened the envelope, still read every line with a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it was a sign of regret, a small door reopening for me to return. But it wasn't. Inside was a set of carefully prepared legal documents written in cold, precise language, without a single unnecessary word or trace of emotion. The message was clear. I, Grace Myers, forfeited all inheritance rights from the family, and the Myers family bore no legal or moral obligation to me or to any child born to me. I read those words over and over again, trying to understand them, but really trying to accept that this was not a temporary reaction, not a burst of anger from one night, but a calculated decision, carefully prepared and executed with absolute coldness. What hurt the most wasn't losing money or inheritance. I wasn't even thinking about that at the time, but the way they turned me into a legal issue, a liability that needed to be removed through paperwork, signatures, and official seals. I was no longer their daughter. I had become a party in a legal document, a name that needed to be erased to protect the family's reputation. And even more cruelly, they didn't just cut me off. They cut off my unborn child as well, as if that life had no right to exist in their story. I remember sitting there for a long time after reading it, the papers still in my hands, my mind completely blank. Marcus asked what it was, and when I showed him, I saw his expression change. Not with surprise, but with anger on my behalf. But strangely, I didn't feel angry anymore. Maybe the pain had gone beyond what anger could reach, or maybe something inside me had simply shut down, accepting that what I had once hoped for would never happen. I kept those documents carefully folded and stored away, not because I thought I would need them someday, but because I needed something tangible to remind myself that all of this was real, that I hadn't imagined the coldness, hadn't exaggerated the pain, it had truly happened. And in that moment, I realized there was no going back. No more what ifs. No more hope that things would somehow fix themselves. The bridge had been completely burned, and I was standing on the other side alone, with nothing to rely on but myself. It was terrifying, but at the same time, it gave me a clarity I had never had before. If I had no family to return to then, I would have to build my life from the ground up, not to prove anything to them, but to prove to myself that I could survive, that I could stand on my own, and that I could create a future that didn't depend on anyone's approval. When Lily was born, it wasn't a perfect moment like the stories people often tell. There were no flowers filling the hospital room, no family waiting outside with tears of joy. But for me, it was the most sacred and powerful moment I had ever experienced. I remember that day clearly, every small detail etched into my memory. The smell of disinfectant in the hospital, the cold white lights, the overwhelming pain that seemed endless, and then finally, Lily's first cry, strong and full of life. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I looked down at her tiny face. Her eyes closed her soft skin, and in that moment, all my fears and self-doubt seemed to fade into the background. I was no longer the 16-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her home, no longer the one who always felt like she wasn't enough. I was a mother, and this little life depended entirely on me. That realization was both terrifying and empowering at the same time. The first days after Lily was born were far from easy. In fact, they were harder than anything I had imagined. The exhaustion, sleepless nights, financial stress, and uncertainty about the future all came crashing in at once, and there were moments when I felt like I couldn't go on. Marcus was still there, still working harder, still keeping his promise that I wasn't alone. But both of us knew that this life didn't leave room for mistakes. Every decision, no matter how small, could directly affect Lily. There were nights when I sat awake watching her sleep in a worn-out crib, wondering if I was capable of giving her a better life, or if I would end up repeating the same mistakes my own family had made. But every time she moved, every time she opened her eyes and looked at me, I felt a connection so powerful that it couldn't be put into words. She didn't know anything about my past, didn't know how I had been rejected, yet she trusted me completely, and that trust was something I refused to break. I started doing everything I could to improve our situation, from finishing my education, to finding small jobs, to learning how to balance caring for her while building a future. I didn't have a perfect plan, no guidance from family, but I had one clear goal: to make sure Lily would never feel unwanted the way I once did. That became my greatest motivation, stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion. I sent my parents a birth announcement along with a small photo of Lily, not because I expected them to come back, but because a part of me still wanted them to know that the child they had rejected existed, was alive, and deserved to be loved. But there was no response, no call, no letter, no sign that they cared. That silence, even though I expected it, still hurt, but this time it didn't break me. Instead, it strengthened my determination that my past would not define my future. Lily grew day by day, and with her, I grew in ways I had never imagined. I was no longer the scared girl standing in the rain. I was a mother learning to be strong for her child, and it was Lily, not anyone else, who gave me a reason to keep moving forward, even on a path filled with uncertainty and hardship. The first years after Lily was born didn't come with any clear milestones I could proudly look back on, because everything was a continuous cycle of survival, where each day passing simply meant we were still standing. I didn't have time to think far into the future, no space to dream or make long-term plans, because all my energy went into making sure Lily had enough to eat, stayed warm, and was safe. Marcus worked almost non-stop, taking every shift he could at the repair shop, sometimes coming home with oil-stained hands and an exhausted body, yet still managing to smile as he held his daughter. As for me, besides taking care of Lily, I went back to finish my education, step by step, enrolling in community classes that fit around her schedule. There were days I had to bring Lily to class, letting her sleep in a stroller beside me, while I tried to focus on lectures, constantly worried she might wake up and cry. Our life had no stability, only constant effort. Money was always tight, and we learned to stretch every dollar, making use of everything we could, from discounted bread to patched-up clothes. I learned how to sew not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. Yet through those struggles, I began to realize I was becoming stronger every day, not in a glamorous way, but in a quiet, steady, and resilient one. I also started taking on small interior design projects, at first helping friends rearrange their spaces, decorating small apartments with limited budgets. I didn't have professional credentials or formal experience, but I had an eye for design and a sensitivity to space that I hadn't recognized before. Each small project, even if it didn't bring much money, helped build my confidence, showing me that I could do more than just survive day by day. But life never gives you much time to rest. When Lily turned 4, another major turning point hit one I never expected to face so soon. Marcus, the person who had been with me through the hardest days, who had kept his promise that I wasn't alone, died in a traffic accident. A truck ran a red light, and everything ended in seconds. When the police knocked on my door and told me, I remember standing still, unable to cry or speak, as if my body refused to process any more pain. But reality couldn't be avoided. In a single moment, I went from being a young mother with a partner to a completely single parent, with no one to share the burden, no one to lean on in moments of weakness. The small insurance payout Marcus left behind wasn't enough to change much. It only bought me a little time to figure out how to stand on my own again. I could have fallen apart then, and there were moments when I wanted to give up. But every time I looked at Lily, I knew I didn't have that choice. I couldn't let her lose both parents, even if only emotionally. I kept working, kept learning, kept building step by step, slowly, painfully, but without stopping. And during those years, I understood something deeply. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time. Life knocks you down whether you want to or not. If you've ever gone through a major loss, but still had to keep moving forward for someone else, or for yourself, leave a comment and share your story. After Marcus passed away, I didn't have much time to drown in grief, because reality forced me to keep moving forward, one step at a time, even though my heart felt unbearably heavy. The days that followed felt like walking through a thick fog. Everything around me seemed blurred, and I functioned on pure instinct, waking up, taking care of Lily, going to work, and returning to a home that felt emptier than ever. But slowly, as the sharp pain softened into a lingering emptiness, I began to realize that if I didn't change the way I was living, I would remain trapped in a cycle of survival with no way out. It was during this time that I decided to pour all my energy into something that had once been just small side projects: interior design. At first, it was simply a way to earn extra income. But the more I worked, the more I realized it wasn't just a job. It was the only thing that made me feel like I was creating something meaningful. I started taking on more projects, from decorating small apartments to helping real estate agents stage homes for sale. I didn't have an office, a team, or a reputation, only persistence and the ability to see potential in spaces others overlooked. There were days when I worked from morning until late at night, measuring spaces, sketching ideas, rushing home to pick Lily up from school, and then continuing to work after she fell asleep. The exhaustion was unavoidable. But for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was moving forward. The real turning point came in 2012, when I attended a design workshop at a community college. I almost didn't go because I didn't think I was good enough or experienced enough to stand among others in that field. But a small part of me still wanted to try. And that's where I met Eleanor Vance, a woman who would later change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. She had been a creative director at a major design firm and was now retired, looking for a new project. Instead of choosing someone with an impressive resume, she noticed me, someone with nothing but a few simple designs and an unfinished story. After reviewing my work, she said something no one had ever told me before. "You have talent. It's raw, unfinished, but it's real." That sentence wasn't just a compliment. It was the recognition I had been missing my entire life. Eleanor didn't make things easy. She didn't give me shortcuts, but she gave me something far more valuable: guidance, honesty, and belief that I could become a better version of myself. Under her mentorship, I learned to see my work more professionally, to understand the value of design, how to work with clients, and most importantly, how to trust myself. By 2014, after several attempts and failures, I finally secured a small loan to start my own company, a step I had never dared to imagine before. My first office was just a tiny corner in a shared workspace, barely noticeable. But to me, it was proof that I had come a long way from the 16-year-old girl standing in the rain. My company didn't grow overnight. There was no sudden breakthrough, but each small project and satisfied client helped build a solid foundation. I was no longer working just to survive, but to create a real future, not only for myself, but for Lily. And for the first time in my life, I began to believe that my past wasn't an ending, It was just the beginning of a story I was writing for myself. As my company began to grow more steadily, I realized that success doesn't come from a single breakthrough moment, but from hundreds of small decisions made consistently every day. The years after launching my business were a time when I had to transform from a freelancer into someone who truly ran a company. It wasn't just about creating better designs or gaining more clients. It was about managing finances, building a team facing risks, and accepting failure as part of the process. There were projects that didn't go as planned, clients who weren't satisfied, and moments when I questioned whether I was on the right path. But unlike before, I no longer saw those challenges as signs of failure, but as lessons that helped me adjust and move forward. Under Eleanor's guidance, I began to see my work with a broader vision. She taught me that design isn't just about making a space look beautiful. It's about creating emotion, telling a story, and bringing real value to the people who use it. That changed my approach from simply meeting client expectations to deeply understanding their needs, listening more, and daring to present bolder ideas. Gradually, my reputation began to spread not through aggressive promotion, but through satisfied clients recommending me to others. By 2018, my company had grown to 8 employees, a number I had never imagined before. Each person on my team had their own story, their own reason for being there, and together we were building something bigger than ourselves. What made me proud wasn't just the increasing revenue, but the fact that I could create opportunities for others, just as Eleanor had once done for me. Lily was older by then, and began to understand more about my work and everything I had been through. She would often sit in a corner of my small office, doing her homework while I worked, sometimes making innocent comments that turned out to be surprisingly insightful. Watching her grow up in that environment made me realize that even though our life wasn't perfect, it was real and built on genuine effort, not on appearances or reputation, like the family I came from. In 2022, another turning point came when a local magazine decided to feature my journey from a teenage mother rejected by her family to a business founder. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to revisit the past, but I eventually agreed, not to prove anything, but to tell an honest story. The article gained attention quickly, not just because of the hardship, but because of the resilience behind it. I received countless messages from strangers who said they saw themselves in my story, that they too were trying to rebuild their lives after setbacks. That's when I realized that success isn't just measured in numbers or achievements, it's also about how your story can impact others. By then, my company had become stable, no longer a fragile dream, but a solid reality. I was no longer the girl who doubted her worth, but a woman who understood where she came from and what she was capable of. And most importantly, I didn't build this life to prove my parents wrong. I built it to prove to myself that I could create a life I was proud of. No matter where I started, if this story makes you believe you can change your life too, drop a comment and let me know you're on that journey. By 2024, when I looked back on my journey, I could barely recognize the 6-year-old girl who once stood in the rain with a small suitcase and an uncertain future. My life had changed in ways I had never dared to imagine. My company was no longer a makeshift setup in a shared workspace. It had become a stable business with over 20 employees, a team strong enough to handle large and complex projects. We were no longer just decorating small apartments. We were taking on contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, working with clients I had once only seen in magazines. My office overlooked the city, and every time I stood by the window, I didn't just see buildings. I saw the long journey that had brought me there. But if there was one thing I was most proud of, it wasn't the revenue or the company's size, it was Lily. She was now 19, a college student, intelligent, independent, and strong in the way I had always hoped she would be. Lily didn't grow up in perfection, but she grew up in truth. I never hid my past from her, not to burden her, but to help her understand that a person's value is not defined by where they come from, but by the choices they make moving forward. Watching her step confidently into her own life, I knew that despite my mistakes and struggles, I had done one thing right. I didn't let my past destroy her future. And just when I felt like my life had finally reached a place of stability, the past I had spent 20 years leaving behind suddenly returned. One evening, after finishing a client meeting and driving home, I noticed a car parked in front of my house, a luxury vehicle with out-of-state plates. The moment I stepped out, I felt something familiar, yet unwelcome, that something was about to happen. And when I saw the two figures standing at my door, time seemed to stop. My parents. After 20 years of no calls, no messages, no sign of existence, they stood there as if that time had never happened. But what surprised me wasn't just their presence. It was how they showed up, not with hesitation or regret, but with a familiar confidence, as if they still had the right to walk back into my life whenever they wanted. When they said they knew about my son, I almost laughed at the absurdity. They had read an article, saw that I had a child, and built a story in their minds, a successful grandson they could proudly present to their friends, not because they wanted to reconnect with me, but because they needed a piece of me to complete their image. When they offered money for me to attend their anniversary party with this imaginary grandson, I realized that even after 20 years, some things had never changed. To them, I still wasn't a person with feelings. I was a tool, a part of the story they wanted to tell the world. But this time, I was no longer the powerless 6-year-old girl. I had built my life, I understood my worth, and most importantly, I no longer needed their approval to feel enough. And standing there in that moment, I knew this encounter wasn't about the past, it was about how I would choose to face it in the present. If you've ever had your past come back to test you, just when your life was finally stable, leave a comment and share your story. When my parents stepped into my home, the atmosphere in the living room immediately became heavy, as if every memory I had tried to bury for 20 years suddenly came back to life at once. They sat down as if this was still a familiar space to them, their eyes scanning every detail of my house, from the wooden floors to the bookshelves and the artwork on the walls. The same way my father used to evaluate a property, not the way a father would look at the life his daughter had built. My mother sat upright, her hands folded, maintaining that same controlled posture, as if everything was still part of her plan. I stood across from them, not sitting down, not offering water, because I knew this wasn't a reunion. It was a transaction they had already prepared for. And sure enough, after a few brief pleasantries, they got straight to the point. They talked about their 50th wedding anniversary, a large event with hundreds of guests, people of status, people they always tried to impress. They talked about reputation, about the questions that had begun to surface from their community regarding their third daughter who had disappeared, about how the story they had maintained for years was no longer convincing enough. And then they spoke about what they truly wanted, me and the grandson they believed I had. When my father pulled out a blank check and placed it on the table, I felt a familiar but still painful sensation, the feeling of being assigned a value. He named a number, $250,000, as if it were a reasonable price for 20 years of silence, 20 years of being erased. They wanted me to attend the party with my son, stand beside them, take photos, smile, and play the role of a perfect family in front of everyone. 3 hours, that was all they needed to preserve the image they had built. My mother added that they were willing to reinstate me into the family trust, to share an estate worth millions of dollars, as if everything that had happened could be resolved with money and material benefits. I looked at the check, then at them, and in that moment I realized they had never truly understood what they had done. To them, the problem wasn't that they had abandoned me. It was that the story might damage their image in front of others. When I asked what would happen if I refused, my father's voice hardened, losing the polite tone he had started with. He implied that they could contact my child directly, that they could tell their version of the story, that they could still control the situation if necessary. It wasn't just an offer, it was a carefully disguised threat. But this time I didn't feel fear. I was no longer the girl who had been thrown out with no choices. I was someone who had built a life from nothing. Someone who had learned to stand without their approval. I realized they didn't come for me, they came because they needed me. And that difference changed everything. When Lily appeared at the top of the stairs and walked down, everything became even clearer. The truth they hadn't anticipated began to surface, and for the first time, I saw them lose control. They were no longer the ones dictating the outcome. They were the ones trying to save a collapsing narrative. And standing in that moment, I understood that the power they once held over me no longer existed. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. And most importantly, I didn't need to play a role in their story anymore. The moment Lily walked down the stairs that day was when everything changed completely. Not just for my parents, but for me as well. I still remember the way she stood on the last step, her expression calm but firm, as if she had been preparing for this confrontation for a long time, even though it had only unfolded within minutes. My mother reacted, first her expression shifting from surprise to confusion, then quickly trying to regain control. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady, but still trying to sound composed. I didn't need time to think about my answer, because the truth was no longer something I needed to hide. "This is Lily, my daughter," I said, each word clear and unwavering. The room seemed to freeze, and I could see my father taking a few seconds to process what he had just heard. "Daughter," he repeated, his voice lower, as if that single word shattered the entire narrative he had prepared. They had come with a story already built, a successful grandson. An image easy to present and boast about, but the truth didn't fit into that version at all. And for the first time, they couldn't control the situation by adjusting the narrative. Lily stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the two strangers standing in her living room. "I think I know who you are," she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "You're the ones who threw my mom out when she was pregnant with me." The words landed clearly, without hesitation or avoidance, and I saw my mother take a small step back, as if pushed by the truth she had tried to deny. My father tried to regain control, taking a deep breath before speaking in the same authoritative tone he always used. "It was more complicated than that," he said, but Lily interrupted him immediately. "What part was complicated? The part where you threw a 16-year-old girl out in the rain? Or the part where you pretended for 20 years that she didn't exist?" The question left the room in complete silence. There were no more vague explanations, no way to soften the truth. I looked at Lily and noticed the slight tremble in her hands, but her voice remained steady, and in that moment, I realized she was stronger than I had ever been at her age. My mother tried a different approach, her voice softening, as if she was trying to persuade. "We can fix the story," she said. "You can come to the party as a granddaughter who has just returned from studying abroad." I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. 20 years had passed, yet their way of dealing with problems hadn't changed, not by admitting the truth or expressing regret, but by rewriting the story to protect their image. Lily let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I was born and raised here," she said. "I don't need to pretend to be someone else, just to make you feel better about yourselves." My father began to lose patience, bringing the conversation back to the party. The timing, the need for an answer, as if everything was just a plan that needed to stay on schedule. But at that moment, I no longer saw them as people who had the power to decide anything in my life. I stood up, walked toward the door, and said something I had never imagined saying to them: "You should leave." There was no anger in my voice, only finality. I didn't need to argue or prove anything, because the truth had already spoken for itself. As they walked away, I stood there watching, no longer feeling fear or pain like before, only a clarity I had never had. And when the door closed behind them, I knew that this time they weren't the ones setting the boundaries, I was. After my parents left the house, returned to silence, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet I had once longed for. It was a heavy stillness where thoughts began to flood in all at once. I stood in the living room for a long time, staring at the empty space where they had just been trying to process what had actually happened. 20 years of no contact, no sign of existence. And then suddenly, they appeared, bringing demands, offers, and even subtle threats. But this time, instead of feeling pulled back into their control, I felt something completely different, a clarity I had never experienced before. I was no longer the girl who needed their approval to feel worthy, and that allowed me to see everything more objectively. Lily stood beside me, silent for a moment before asking, "What are you going to do?" That question wasn't just about the party or my parents, it was about how I would face my past. I knew I could refuse, close the door, and continue living the life I had built without looking back. But deep down, I also knew that if I did, that my story would always remain in their hands, told the way they wanted it to be, and the truth would stay hidden. That night, after Lily went to bed, I took out the box I had kept for years, the one holding the documents my parents had used to cut me off. I opened each page, rereading every line of cold legal language. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel pain when looking at them. I felt certainty. These were no longer wounds, they were evidence. I took photos of each page, storing them carefully. Not for revenge, but to ensure that if needed, I could tell the truth in a way no one could deny. The next morning, I called Mrs. Torres, the woman who had witnessed everything 20 years ago. When I told her what had happened, she wasn't surprised. She simply sighed and said that some people never change. When I asked if she would be willing to confirm what she saw, she agreed immediately without hesitation. The certainty in her voice reminded me that I wasn't alone in this story, that the truth didn't exist, only in my memory. Piece by piece, everything became clearer. The documents, the witnesses, and the story I had carried for 20 years. I began to think seriously about the anniversary party my parents had mentioned, not as an obligation, but as an opportunity. Not an opportunity for them to fix their image, but for me to reclaim my story. I talked to Lily about it, and what surprised me most was that she wasn't afraid. Instead, she wanted to stand with me. I don't want them to tell our story their way, she said. If you go, I'm going with you. That moment made me realize this wasn't just my confrontation, it was ours. I also reached out to my brother and sister who had remained silent for 20 years. For the first time, they admitted they had been wrong, that they hadn't stood up for me when it mattered. I didn't know if that regret could make up for the past, but I knew that this time I wasn't alone. Step by step, I prepared for what I knew would change everything. Not because I wanted to hurt my parents, but because I was no longer willing to be erased. And in that moment, I understood that facing the past isn't about going back to it. It's about standing firmly in the present and deciding how your story will be told. If you've ever had to stand up and protect your own truth, leave a comment and share your journey. My parents' anniversary celebration was held at a luxurious hotel where every detail was perfectly arranged, so precise that there was almost no room for imperfection, from the lighting to the table settings and even the placement of guests. When Lily and I walked into the hall, I could feel eyes turning toward us, not because they recognized who we were, but because our presence didn't fit the expected narrative. I wore a simple but elegant dress, not to impress, but to feel confident in myself. Lily stood beside me, slightly taller, her gaze calm yet sharp, showing no sign of fear. As we moved deeper into the main area, I saw my parents standing in the center of the crowd, smiling, shaking hands, exchanging congratulations, fully immersed in the roles they had played for 50 years. But their smiles faltered the moment they saw me. It wasn't complete surprise. They knew I might come, but they clearly hadn't anticipated how I would appear, not alone, and not in the way they had imagined. As I approached, conversations around us began to fade, as if people sensed something was about to happen. My father tried to regain control, placing a hand on my shoulder in a stiff gesture, as though trying to turn the moment into part of a performance. "You made it," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I nodded, but I didn't respond in the way he expected. When he began introducing Lily to a group of guests as a granddaughter returning from afar, I knew that was the moment I had to decide. I looked at Lily, and she gave me a small nod, a signal that I didn't have to stay silent anymore. I stepped forward, my voice not loud, but clear enough to cut through the murmur. "I think there's something that needs to be clarified before this story continues," I said. All attention shifted toward me, and I could see the tension on my parents' faces. I didn't rush because I was no longer running. 20 years ago, when I was 16 and pregnant, I was thrown out of my home on a rainy night. Not because I had done something dangerous, but because I didn't fit the image this family wanted to maintain. The words froze the space around us. Some people exchanged looks, others began whispering, but I continued. I spoke about the legal letter, about being completely cut off, about the years I spent building a life on my own, not to gain sympathy, but to place the truth where it belonged. When I spoke about Lily, I placed my hand on her shoulder, not to protect her, but to affirm her place. This is my daughter, not a revised story, not an image created to please anyone but the truth. I didn't need to look at my parents to know how they were reacting, because I could feel the shift in the room, from their confidence to a loss of control. My father tried to interrupt, saying this wasn't the right place, but this time I didn't stop. "There is no right place for the truth if it is always hidden," I said. When I finished, there was no applause, no dramatic reaction, Just silence, heavy but honest. And in that moment, I knew I had done what I needed to do, not to destroy them, but to free myself from a story I had never been allowed to tell. After I finished speaking, the silence in the room was no longer just a brief pause. It became something heavy and dense, where every glance and every thought seemed to be trying to process what had just been revealed. No one spoke immediately, but the shift was undeniable. The people who had been smiling and chatting moments before now exchanged uncertain looks, some stepping back slightly, as if needing distance from a situation they had suddenly become part of. I looked around the room, not searching for approval, but realizing that the story was no longer just mine. It had been placed in front of everyone, impossible to edit or hide any longer. My father stood there, his expression visibly changed, shifting from confidence and control to something I had never seen before: confusion, anger, and helplessness. He tried to say something, but his words no longer carried the same clarity or authority, because for the first time he no longer controlled how the story was told. My mother, on the other hand, said nothing. She stood still, her eyes scanning the room, as if searching for an invisible way out. What became clear to me was that they didn't know how to respond when they could no longer rely on reputation, money, or influence to shape the situation. An older guest, likely a longtime friend of the family, stepped forward and asked a simple but direct question: "Is this true?" The question wasn't directed only at me or my parents, it was directed at the truth, standing in the middle of the room. I didn't answer immediately because I knew the answer no longer depended on my words. The evidence I had prepared the story I had just told, and my parents' silence had already said everything. My father attempted to push back, claiming everything had been misunderstood, that it was just a difficult period for the family, but his voice lacked the certainty it once had. And in that moment, Lily stood beside me, saying nothing, yet her presence alone was the clearest answer. No story could erase a person standing right in front of everyone. One by one, people in the room reacted in their own ways. Some quietly left, unwilling to be involved any further. Others stayed, but kept their distance. And some looked at me with a completely different expression, not curiosity, but respect. No one said it out loud, but I could feel that the balance of power in the room had shifted. My parents were no longer the admired center, they had become the ones being questioned. And most importantly, for the first time, I was no longer in a defensive position. I didn't need to explain further or argue because the truth stood on its own. When I turned to Lily, she gently took my hand, a small gesture, but enough to remind me that I wasn't alone in that moment. We weren't there to defeat anyone, not to bring anyone down, but to reclaim the right to tell our own story. And as I walked out of that room, I didn't feel like I had destroyed anything. I felt like I had finally closed a chapter that should have ended long ago. After that night, my life didn't suddenly become perfect, nor did it turn into a fairy tale where everything was healed and everyone found peace. But one thing changed clearly: I was no longer bound by my past. When Lily and I returned home, we didn't say much, not because there was nothing to say, but because we both understood that what had just happened had already said everything. I stood in the living room, looking at the familiar space I had built piece by piece, and for the first time, I felt a deep sense of relief, as if a weight I had carried for 20 years had finally been lifted. I didn't need an apology from my parents. I didn't need them to admit their mistakes or try to fix anything anymore, because I had already given myself the answer I needed. In the weeks that followed, I received responses from people who had been at the event, some messages of apology from those who hadn't known the truth, some words of encouragement from strangers, and silence from others who chose to stay out of it. But the important thing was I no longer sought validation from any of them. I continued my work, continued building my company, continued living the life I had created, not to prove anything to the world, but because it was the life I had chosen. Lily also changed after that night, not in a negative way, but in a more mature one. She understood our family story more clearly. But instead of being weighed down by the past, she stood stronger in the present. We didn't talk much about my parents. Not because we were avoiding it, but because they were no longer the center of our lives. They became a part of the story, not the whole story. Sometimes I still think about them, not with anger, but with a sense of distance, as if they belong to a chapter that has already closed. I don't know if they will ever truly understand what they did, but that no longer matters. What matters is that I understand myself. I understand that a person's value does not come from where they are born, nor from the acceptance of family or society, but from the choices they make and how they face what happens to them. If I could say something to my 16-year-old self back then, I would say it won't be easy. There will be moments when you feel like you can't go on, but you will find strength in places you never expected. You will build a life that isn't perfect, but it will be yours, and that will be enough. And perhaps the most important thing I learned from everything is this: you cannot control where you begin, but you always have the power to decide where you go. The past may shape you, but it does not define you unless you allow it. And when I look at Lily at the future, she is stepping into, I know that our story is no longer about what we lost, but about what we created from those losses.